I have never been a man of few words. I have always believed that my life was firmly anchored in faith, obedience, and the fear of God. Since I was a child, I was taught that the path to blessing came through religious discipline, faithful tithing, and active participation in the church. I never questioned it. As the years went by, my spiritual routine became meticulous. Every Sunday, I took my place in the second row of the church, faithfully giving exactly 10% of my income and attentively listening to each sermon, convinced that I was doing everything right. However, my heart was far from any true fervor. At that moment, I didn't realize, but my relationship with God was transactional. I gave hoping to receive, obeyed hoping for protection, and did in anticipation of reward. To me, spiritual life was a mathematical equation, and I believed I was always in the black. On that specific day, my mind was occupied with everyday concerns. It was a Tuesday like any other, and I was returning home after a business meeting. As I drove, I mentally went over the numbers for the month, planning my next contribution to the church and organizing my upcoming religious commitments for the week. That was when everything happened. The traffic light was green for me, and I moved forward without hesitation. I didn't see the truck coming from the right. I didn't perceive the brutal speed at which it crossed the intersection. The impact was immediate, a deafening crash followed by absolute silence. Everything vanished in the blink of an eye. The car, the street, the noise, even the fear. In an instant, I was no longer there. The first thing I noticed was the absence of my body. There was no weight, no pain, not even a physical outline I could recognize as my own. Yet I existed. My consciousness was there, awake, vivid, and then came the light. But it wasn't an ordinary light, one that dazzles or blinds. It was a living, pulsating presence that enveloped every fraction of my being in a way that human words cannot translate. There were no shadows, only a golden, vibrant clarity, as if the very air were imbued with an indescribable energy. It was neither hot nor cold, simply perfect. And it was at that moment when I sensed something even stranger. I was not alone. It felt as though there was something or someone around me, watching me, not with physical eyes, but with a perception so profound that I felt my soul completely naked. There was no way to hide anything. I was utterly exposed, and all I felt was an overwhelming mixture of peace and reverence. It was then that everything around me began to take shape, as if the light itself adapted to my understanding. I could see, but not with my eyes. I could hear, but not with my ears. The colors were not like those on earth. They were more vivid, more pure, as if each hue carried its own meaning. There was something there that seemed to vibrate in the air. A soundless melody, a silent harmony that filled everything with a feeling I can only describe as home. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to exist without fear, without worries, without the need to prove anything to anyone. I was before something magnificent, something divine, something that made everything else seem small and insignificant. And deep down, I knew that this was just the beginning. I couldn't say how much time had passed since the moment of impact. However, time seemed irrelevant there. It was as if I were in a space where past, present, and future blended into one continuous existence. The feeling of being watched intensified, but it was not an oppressive scrutiny. It was as if a presence were analyzing me with absolute love, like a father observing a child who has finally come home after a long time lost. But alongside that love came an uncomfortable revelation. I couldn't hide. I couldn't make excuses. I couldn't cling to the certainties that had supported me all my life. I saw myself like never before, not just my actions, but also the intentions behind them. And what I saw caused a deep tightening in my chest, as if a huge weight had been placed upon me. I thought my faith was solid, but in that instant, I knew I had lived a lie. It was then that I felt the presence drawing closer. I heard no footsteps. There was no grand manifestation, but somehow I just knew someone was there. It was impossible to confuse or question him. Even before I understood his appearance, before I realized what was happening, I already knew who was standing before me. His presence carried something indescribable, a mix of power, holiness, and love that penetrated every part of my being. I didn't need to ask. I didn't need introductions. I knew it was him, Jesus. And in that instant, all my conviction, all my certainty, all my confidence in my own righteousness crumbled. My instinct was immediate. I fell to my knees, not by choice, but simply because there was nothing else I could do in the presence of such majesty. I couldn't speak. My mind was flooded with thoughts, but none could find their way to become words. It was as if my very tongue had been taken by an absolute reverence. Yet my heart screamed in confusion, in shame, in a silent despair that only I could hear. It was in that moment when my years of religious obedience emerged, like a fragile shield, trying to protect me. I wanted to say that I had always been a faithful man, that I never stopped tithing, that I actively participated in the church, that I followed every rule with discipline. But before any word could leave my mouth, Jesus looked at me, and in that gaze, I saw everything. It wasn't a look of condemnation or accusation, but it was also not a look that allowed me to escape the truth. It was a gaze that pierced me, that stripped my soul down to its deepest core. And then, with a voice that was both serene and full of authority, he asked, "Do you know why you are here?" The question hit me like a punch. I thought I knew. My mind tried to race for answers, but all I found were empty justifications. It was then that everything began to unfold before my eyes. My own life played out like a film, but not in the way I remembered it. Every act, every decision, every thought and hidden intention was exposed with devastating clarity. I saw the moments when I was generous, but I realized I did so more out of obligation than love. I saw the times I helped someone, but also the countless occasions when I chose to ignore those in need because it wasn't convenient for me. I saw my faith, but I realized it was nothing more than an empty equation, a mechanical contract where I tried to buy God's favor. With each scene unfolding before me, I felt something breaking in my chest. There was no turning away, no way to justify myself. It was as if I were watching the story of a stranger. Yet at the same time, I knew that stranger was me. I saw the times I went to church and religiously gave my tithe, always calculating exactly 10% of my income. But I also saw what was behind that. It wasn't generosity, it wasn't devotion. It was fear that if I didn't give, God would punish me, fear that my financial life would collapse, fear that blessings would be taken from me. My heart was never in it. And now, before him, I understood it with a clarity that hurt. I saw the moments when I made empty, repetitive prayers, words spoken more out of habit than a true desire to talk to God. I saw myself fulfilling all the religious rituals, but my heart was far away. The worst part wasn't seeing what I did, but feeling what Jesus felt as he watched me. And what he felt was not anger or disdain, it was sadness, a deep sadness, like that of a father watching his child waste their life, believing they are on the right path, when in reality they are drifting further away. And that crushed me inside. I always thought God wanted my obedience above all. But there before him, I realized that what he wanted was my heart, my surrender, my love. and I had never given it to him. My relationship with God was a cold contract, an exchange of favors. I expected blessings in return for my faithfulness. I followed rules, but I had never truly surrendered. My heart was weighed down by an indescribable burden, and for the first time, I felt genuine remorse. The shame was overwhelming. It was as if an invisible wall surrounded me, trapping me within my own hypocrisy. I wanted to speak. I wanted to plead for a second chance. I wanted to explain that I never intended to treat God like a divine bank, that I genuinely believed I was doing everything right. But how could I argue against the truth? My words were as empty as my faith had been. I felt naked, exposed, with nothing left to hide. My chest ached, and if I had still had a physical body at that moment, I'm sure I would have felt a knot forming in my throat. Then, as if he knew exactly what was happening inside me, and I knew that he knew, Jesus stepped forward. His presence was overwhelming, not just because of the power that radiated from him, but because of the love he carried, a love that constricted me. I had ignored it while I thought I was serving him. It was in that moment that I understood something I had never grasped in all my years of religious life. God didn't want my money, my offerings, my rituals. I had never truly trusted him. I relied on the system, on my own ability to buy protection through my deeds. But before him, I realized how insignificant all my attempts to justify myself were. Tears streamed down my face, although I couldn't say if my body there had eyes to cry. It was a pain that came from the soul, a mix of regret and release. I no longer needed to hide. I no longer needed to pretend. For the first time, I understood that my faith had always been an empty shell. And for the first time, I desperately wished I could go back and do everything differently. I wanted to speak, but my mouth couldn't find the words. There was no defense, no justification, just a raw and undeniable truth. I had never truly known him. I had always served an idea of God, a system of rules and rewards, but never him. My faith was like a house built on sand. And now that everything was exposed, it was collapsing before my eyes. For the first time, I understood what the passage I had so often heard in church meant. Not everyone who says to me, "Lord, Lord," will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. I had spent my whole life calling him Lord, but I had never truly surrendered to his will. I was too busy trying to balance the books with God, while neglecting what he truly wanted, a sincere offering, true love, a real relationship. It was then that the scene before me changed. The golden, heavenly light that filled everything around me began to dissolve, and a new environment emerged before my eyes. Jesus said nothing, but I understood that he wanted to show me something else. What I saw made me tremble. I was looking at a place so beautiful that no description could do it justice. It was as if every color had a life of its own. Every particle of air vibrated in harmony with a celestial melody that my soul could feel. I saw people, but they didn't just seem to be there. They belonged in that place as if they had never known another existence apart from it. They radiated pure joy, absolute peace, and indescribable love, and then an uncontrollable desire. I wanted to stay there. I wanted to be a part of that place for the first time, not because I thought I deserved it, but because I finally understood what it meant to truly be with God. My heart burned within me. I felt a peace I had never experienced before, something that transcended any earthly joy I had known. At that moment, I realized that this was not just a place, but a state of existence, a return home for those who truly belong to God. The love there was palpable, like a force that filled everything. even the air I breathed, if I still needed to breathe. I wanted to run to that place. I wanted to be enveloped by that divine presence. I wanted to lose myself in that love. But before I could take a single step, I felt again the presence of Jesus by my side. His gaze was firm, but filled with compassion. Without saying a word, he made me understand that there was still more to see. And then, in an instant, everything changed. The brightness, the peace. All was ripped away from me, as if I had been sucked into another reality. The light disappeared and a suffocating void took its place. The atmosphere around me was dark, but it wasn't just the darkness that made it terrifying. It was the weight, the oppression, the absolute absence of hope. The air felt heavy, dense, loaded with something I couldn't fully describe. What I felt was not just fear, but a despair that came from within, as if something was dragging me into a bottomless abyss. And then I listened. At first there were whispers, distant moans, but as my senses adjusted to that place, the sounds turned into screams. Screams of pain, of regret, of absolute terror. Voices crying, "Help," but seeming to get lost in a void without answers. Never in my life had I felt something so suffocating. Never, not even in my worst nightmares, did I imagine a place like that. The horror of that place was indescribable. It wasn't just what I saw or heard, but what I felt. There was a weight there, a suffocating presence that seemed to squeeze my soul, as if it wanted to tear away every spark of hope still left inside me. It wasn't just physical pain. It was existential despair, an overwhelming certainty that everything was lost. I saw shadows moving, human figures that seemed to writhe in the midst of a living darkness. Some cried, others screamed, and some just stood there, motionless, as if they had already given up, even on suffering. But the worst were their gazes. When some of them looked at me, I felt something terrible pierce through my chest. Their eyes were filled with a remorse with no way out, a burden of wrong decisions that could never be undone. I understood, without anyone having to tell me, that those people were not there because God hated them, but because they had rejected everything He offered. It was then that the voice of Jesus echoed within me, not as a sound, but as a truth that resonated directly in my soul. This is what it means to live away from me. When you cling to your own heart and live only for yourself, this is the fruit of that choice. Those words pierced me like daggers. I brutally realized that hell was not a punishment imposed by God, but the consequence of a life without Him. Those who were there had not been placed in that place. They had chosen that destiny, even without realizing it. Like me, many of them had followed a path of empty religiosity, self-preservation, a false faith based on rituals. Hell was not a place of arbitrary punishment. It was the natural result of an existence that rejected the only one who could save them, and for a terrible moment, an uncontrollable fear seized me. What if that were also my fate? Fear gripped me in a way I had never felt before. It wasn't an ordinary fear like losing something or suffering a consequence. It was absolute terror, a crushing anguish as I realized that if I had died in that accident, without that opportunity, that could have been my destiny. My heart raced, or at least that was the feeling, even though I didn't know if I still had a body. There was no way out, no refuge, just that dense atmosphere of sadness and suffering. It was at that moment that I felt a presence beside me. Jesus was still there, and His presence was the only thing keeping me from being consumed by despair. Then, for the first time since it all began, I spoke, or perhaps I just thought it, but I knew He was listening. "Please forgive me." My voice was small, weak, like that of a child who finally understands he has disobeyed his father and is now lost. It was then that Jesus reached out his hand to me. His gaze still held authority, but there was now something stronger than anything else: love. You still have a choice. His words resonated within me like a silent thunder. My body, or my soul, or whatever I was at that moment, trembled. I was not condemned. I still had a chance, but it wasn't just a chance to escape that fate. It was a chance to truly live, to do what I had never done. Trust in him, not in religious formulas, not in tithes, not in calculated good deeds, but in him. My heart filled with an intense desire to return, not to continue my life as it was before, but to live it the way I should have from the beginning. I wanted to truly surrender, and then everything began to change. The sensation was abrupt. The gloomy and oppressive atmosphere dissolved before my eyes, as if being sucked into another place. The presence of Jesus was still the last thing I felt, but now it was becoming more distant, as if an invisible force were pulling me back. My body, of which I wasn't even sure I still had, began to feel something different. Weight. It was as if I were sinking into an ocean and suddenly being pulled back to the surface with just one gasp of air in my lung. And then I heard muffled sounds, distant voices, the constant beeping of machines, the smell of antiseptic filling my nostrils. Even before I opened my eyes, I knew where I was. I was alive. My vision was still blurry, but I could make out faces around me. Doctors, nurses, and then, further back, family and friends with incredulous expressions. One of the nurses was holding my hand, her eyes wide as if she was witnessing a miracle. He came back. I heard someone murmur, and only then did I realize I had been on the brink of death. The doctors said something about how they had pronounced me lost for a few minutes, that my recovery defied any logical explanation. But I knew that this was not just a second chance to live, but to truly live. My heart was pounding in my chest, but it wasn't fear. It was gratitude. And along with that gratitude came an absolute certainty. I would never be the same again. In the days that followed, while I was recovering in the hospital, I kept silent for a long time. There was something within me that I couldn't express in words, a different weight, but no longer one of guilt or despair. Rather, it was one of responsibility. I knew I hadn't returned just to continue life as before. Something in me had been torn away and replaced with a truth I could no longer ignore. What tormented me the most was not the vision of hell or the sadness in Jesus' eyes as he showed me my hypocrisy, but the fact that I had spent my whole life thinking I was on the right path without ever truly knowing God. I could no longer see my faith as I once did. I could not pray mechanically or calculate my tithe as if it were a bill to be paid. All of that seemed so insignificant now, so distant from what truly mattered. For the first time, I wanted to give without measuring, to love without expecting anything in return, to serve without fear of losing. For the first time, my faith was not a contract. It was a surrender. But there was a challenge I hadn't anticipated. How could I share what I experienced? How could I tell the people around me that what they considered faith might just be an illusion, just as it was for me? I started slowly, first with my wife, then with my pastor. It wasn't easy. Many looked at me with suspicion. Others said I had simply hallucinated. But there were those who listened with open hearts, who felt something within them resonate with my word. Little by little, I understood that my mission was not to convince anyone, but to live that truth in such a real way that it became impossible to ignore. I no longer wanted to just attend church. I wanted to be the church. I didn't want to measure my generosity anymore. I wanted my whole life to be an offering. I didn't want to follow rules. I wanted to love God the way He always wanted me to love. Over time, I learned to live that new reality. It wasn't easy. For years, I was conditioned to see faith as a series of obligations, and letting go of that mindset required more than just a simple decision. It required a daily transformation. The world around me didn't change. People remained the same, and many still viewed my story with skepticism. But I changed. My relationship with God became alive, vibrant, real. Praying was no longer a habit, but a genuine dialogue. What used to be a monotonous routine became a privilege. And the most incredible realization was that when I truly surrendered, the guilt and fear I had always carried simply vanished. For the first time, I was free. Not free from difficulties, but free from the burden of trying to earn something that was always freely given. Today, looking back, I know my experience was more than just a calling. It was a gifting. Not everyone has the chance to see the truth before it's too late. And that's why I share my story, because I know there are many like me, living a faith that bases their spiritual security on empty practices without truly knowing God. If you're reading this, I ask just one thing. Don't wait for a near-death experience to realize what really matters. God doesn't just want your obedience. He wants your heart. He wants your surrender. I had to die to understand it, but you don't need to. So what do you think? Are many people living a faith that is solely based on rituals without truly knowing God? Have you ever had an experience that changed the way you view life and spirituality? Share it with me in the comments. I really want to hear your thoughts. And if this video made you reflect, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because every week there are transformative contents like this. It helps a lot and ensures you don't miss anything. Now, if you want to continue this journey and learn even more about supernatural experiences that changed lives, watch this video here on the screen. You'll be amazed. See you in the next video. May God be with you.